Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. A few reminders as we get started. Just a little read-off here. IACP would like to remind the audience that taking flash photos during the session are prohibited, as well as taking photos of the slide presentations. And the session's being video recorded. So when we get to the Q&A part of the presentation, if you can just step to one of the microphones there in the aisleways, we can do the Q&A that way. That way you'll be able to capture your question as part of the video recording. So I'm Professor Terrell, along with Professor Paolini. I'm from Arizona State, as the slide says, and Gene's local here at the University of Central Florida. And we put this presentation together, you see with the title, where we're going to talk about use of force policies. And we prompt the question, how does your agency compare? And to answer this question, we'll flip to the next slide here. We answer this question by looking back on a federally funded project by the National Institute of Justice. If we go back about 12, 13 years, NIJ put out a solicitation asking for studies on use of force policies. And as we looked at the landscape, there was no systematic knowledge of how police agencies were guiding officers via policy. It was simply very ad hoc. Agencies would call one another, you would share some ideas, pretty typical, right? But the DOJ wanted to know, well, is there some kind of systematic approach to policy guidance? And that's what this project was designed, to answer that question. Is there a model policy? Is there a common policy? Are some policies essentially better than others across the variety of outcomes, such as injuries, or how much force are used, or citizen complaints? So as you see here, that's how we set up the study. First, we wanted to know about what kind of variation, what kind of differences there are across the country. And then we wanted to look at specific agencies and see if some policies were essentially better in terms of officers feeling it provided them proper guidance. And then also, is there a relationship to use of force outcomes, such as the level of force, complaints, and injuries. So here, we'll just run through kind of the typical model from the academic side of the equation. It's nice to be here presenting to a practitioner-oriented audience like this, because we're usually doing it at a scholarly setting. And that scholarly model generally follows, as you see here. We do the project, we get money from the feds, we do the project, we produce a final report, we write a book or potentially book chapters within an edited book. We write journal articles, mainly to scholarly audience, and maybe we get a master or doctoral dissertations out of that where we train our students within this method. And we certainly did that. And so here's the final report. It came out a few years ago. If you want all the details, it's a 300-page document with a lot of extreme detail of how we went through the study. We also did a book. You see the journal articles, so we're following all this traditional academic model. And we also did a couple of doctoral students that now have their PhDs as a result of data generated from the project. Today, the intent of today's particular, putting this panel together, was to do what we say here, a post hoc look at project findings, looking back and trying to collectively group up 10 years worth of research into one particular presentation, and also give you kind of practitioner takeaways. And at the end of this presentation particularly, we're going to have a section we call practitioner quick hitter takeaways. But all of these takeaways we give you are published somewhere. So this is going to be available in the recorded session. Anything, we can only fit so much in an hour. Anything you want to know more about, we can flesh that out in the Q&A. But if we don't get to it, you can find all the information in the published documents that are cited throughout here. So this is stemming from just this summer. We took what we're presenting here today and we put it into a journal format that doesn't follow the normal scholarly format. It's simply a summary of each of the key findings of the project, and you'll find that here. So we went from that big 300-page report to, I think it's 10 or 11 pages, kind of an executive summary of what we found throughout the project, and you can find that right here. So what is this project all about? So the first goal, as you remember, the first idea was to look at identifying extent of variation and use of force policies. And we're mainly looking at less lethal policies. So what did we do? We did a stratified random sample of agencies across the U.S. We surveyed around 1,000, a little over 1,000. We got 662 responses. And we were particularly interested in what are your report and review requirements, what type of policy do you use. Particularly, we were interested in the force continuum. That was part of the original solicitation that the National Institute of Justice put out. To what extent is the force continuum still a part of the law enforcement landscape? There was a lot of discussion, particularly in the police trade magazines, that the force continuum was not of utility and it was going away and we should get away from it for liability reasons and so forth. So we wanted to know to what extent our force continuum policy is still used. And particularly a big interest was what I call here tactical placement of resistance and force. So how do agencies match up specific levels of citizen resistance, and how do they instruct officers to respond with passive resistant suspects, verbally resistant, defensively resistant, aggressive resistant, that sort of thing. So just give you kind of a quick hitter on what we found on each of these. Not surprisingly, most agencies, except for a few of the very small agencies, have a written force policy. The second one we point out here is 95 reported requiring a distinct force report. That was a little bit of surprise to us. The project data ran from 2006 to 2008, so we're 10 years out now. And during that time, 95% were requiring a separate use of force report. We knew more and more agencies were doing it, but we weren't expecting that many to do it. So that was one key finding. And then 91% reported that the force report was reviewed beyond kind of the sergeant or lieutenant at the shift level. Now, we'll come back to that a little bit when we get to the specifics of our in-depth look at 8 agencies, because it didn't necessarily play out that way in practice. In terms of the second question about the force continuum, you see the key findings here. 80% of the agencies were reporting that they are using a force continuum, some type of force continuum. We'll go through some examples within their policy. So they're instructing officers to use a force continuum in some format. And the predominant type that's used, you see the linear design, kind of that step-by-step progression model. By far, nearly 75% of the reporting agencies were using that versus the other types of designs. And again, we'll go through some of these examples. The last part of phase 1, which was the critical part, was this linking up resistance and force, or how do you instruct officers to think through that progression of force, and how does it match with citizen resistance? One thing we found of the 476 agencies that answered this question, that second kind of, the first silver bullet there says 123 different permutations. That literally we found across 476 agencies, we had 123 different approaches used by agencies. So there's, right out of the gate, we're getting a feel that there's no typical type of use of force policy being used. But we really couldn't do anything with that many policies. So we tended to see patterns across law enforcement agencies where if you see those 6 categories listed below there, you could, even though there was slight variation across the 123, you know, we grouped them within kind of the presence, verbal direction, and then kind of go up the ladder there for soft hands, pain compliance, hard hands, less lethal weapons, and then deadly force, just to see if we could make sense of it a little bit more. And this is just some of the basic descriptive findings. So you see, in terms of just looking at the continuum side on the force side, you can see here that 23% of the agencies use that top approach. And you see somewhat subtle but potentially important distinctions when you go to the next most common model, the one that 75 agencies use with 20.8%. You see there, pain compliance gets its own level, where the most common pain compliance was put in with physical hard hand. And if you work your way down, you'll see then the next one has soft with pain compliance. So there's nuances to how agencies are doing that, which I don't think is particularly surprising, but it starts to raise the question, is one of these approaches better than the other? In terms of however you define better. We'll show you 7 ways we define better moving on here. And you may think of others as well, but you see the variation in it. We also found that, you know, particularly chemical spray or OC spray and CEDs or the taser presented, again, differences of how some agencies go about it. OC spray, for the most part, you see there's a lot of variation there. Agencies, not quite sure where to put it. You know, roughly a third of the agencies put it with pain compliance, roughly a third put it in with hands-on, and then roughly a third put it in some broader category of impact force or less lethal force. Where with Table 4, you'll see the CEDs a little bit more at the higher end there, where it tends to go with impact force. So OC, a little bit more spread out of where it goes within the policy, CED, a little bit more concentrated. We also found some agencies had specific levels where they put CED or OC spray on their own level. It was a specific progression of force, and you'll see some examples of this as well. And that's what you see here. You see chemical spray, again, after pain compliance or after physical hard hand are the two most frequent categories, where the CEDs are only 13 of them, tended to place it a little bit higher on the continuum. We found the opposite when it came to citizens. When we asked them, well, how do you look at citizen resistance, there's a lot of consensus. Over 80% of the agencies had one of these two models, where the only distinction really being, should we put verbal and passive at the same level, or should we put verbal and passive on distinct level? And then you see the next most common approach, it drops off to only 16 agencies, or 4% of our sample. So then we put this all together, again, the details you'll find in the final report. If we're looking for what's the most common approach used by police agencies, this top one was it. But still, you'll see only 20.2% of agencies use this. So the most frequent approach when agencies link resistance with force and put it into a force continuum framework, the most common approach is still used by only 1 out of every 5 agencies. And again, you'll see some of the kind of distinctions here of where you put, on the top one, you'll see physical hard and impact are together, and pain compliance has its own level, where the next one, pain compliance, is with physical hard, and so forth. So kind of the message here, the message here is that there's no common policy at this stage. We also then looked at the 3 most frequent if the agency is specifically explicitly saying where the OC or CED goes. That seems to be the tricky issue, and you see kind of where the agencies put it in terms of where they think the CED and OC goes. In the first one, chem spray or OC goes before the taser. I think that's becoming more and more common. The second one doesn't list the CED, but it does list chemical spray, and then the last one puts them at the same level. The third one there with 17 agencies at a high level right before deadly. So what are the key takeaways just from this section of the project? Well, most agencies have a force policy. That's a good thing. Most have a distinct force report, and there's some report and review from a supervisor. I think all generally positive findings. The second, I think, is somewhat surprising. Again, if you take out, the importance of this type of study is weeding out kind of the anecdotal or the myth or the lore of sometimes that goes on within every field, and it certainly goes on within law enforcement. We clearly found the force continuum was a large component. Now, we can say, okay, well, that was 10 years ago. But you have to understand, if you look at most of the articles prior to then, the same conversation, the same things we hear today, well, the force continuum's outdated. We were hearing that when we started this project. It's outdated, hardly anyone uses it. We didn't find that. When we look at it systematically, we simply didn't find that. And so that last one kind of became a launching point for phase 2 of the project, that there's no standard policies, that agencies are simply selecting a policy, but they're not linking it to success or what they would deem to be effective. So we wanted to flesh that out a bit in our second phase. So the second phase you see here was really focused on what do officers think. Let's get down to the line level officers, the officers that are using the force. What do they think about their policy, and do they find that it has utility? And then, importantly, are certain policies linked to better outcomes? However you define that. Less force, less severe force, less complaints, less injuries, so on and so forth. So what we did is we selected 8 agencies that agreed to participate in this particular project, and we looked at use of official records, in other words, their use of force reports for a 2-year period, all their complaints, so on and so forth. We surveyed all frontline officers that were working in the field. We did supervisor surveys with first-line supervisors, and then we did mid and upper-level management interviews to get the whole picture of the project. So how do we select these agencies? Well, one requirement was they had a mandate force reporting. That was pretty easy because remember 95% of the agencies require a force report, so that was a pretty easy box to check. This one was a little bit more thorny. There had to have a consistent policy. In other words, no policy change within 2 years because we needed to collect 2 years of consistent data, and we didn't want the policy change during it. So that was a little harder to find, but it was okay. 3 was big for us. We really targeted what we called mid to large agencies. There's no specific definition of that, but we were trying to avoid the very small agencies that wouldn't have much force, that would make it harder to generalize. But we were also trying to avoid the very large agencies, LA, Chicago, that type of thing, that are hard to generalize for those mid type of cities. And then the last 2 are, remember, only 20% of the agencies had a typical model. So we wanted to make sure that we put variation into the different approaches, and you'll see 8 very different approaches here in a minute. And also within tactical placement. So that variation, or that, in other words, difference within the policy, is specifically built into the selection of the agencies. So these were the agencies that we wound up with that were, again, considering mid to large. It goes from the small of Knoxville, Tennessee, up to Columbus. And you can see both the number of sworn and their populations. And in the final report, they're broken down on a whole bunch of other measures like diversity within the city and that sort of thing that you can look at if you want more detail. So here's what the 8 agencies look like in terms of how they were guiding their officers. This is what, and I'm going to use this term quite a bit as we move forward, this is what we consider of the 8 cities, the most restrictive policy. And when we say most restrictive, what we're getting at is this was the agency that gave the kind of boxed in the line level officers, lowered their discretion. They wanted their officers to think through, for instance, if you look at this one, as you're getting into a more physically resistant suspect, they wanted them to have their officers as a priority thought process that we go hard hands before we go to the taser. Not that you have to do it, but this is just the guide, right? It's the policy. There's always out clauses and so forth, and it's changing situational dynamics. But they build into their training and they build into the policy that the taser is something that we want to, or the hard hands, we want something before the taser. So they were fairly explicit in terms of how they wanted their officers to think through. And again, they weren't training, and this policy isn't designed for the step-by-step where you have to start low and move up. You start wherever the citizen starts with. So, if they start with the active aggression, well, of course, you can go right to that level of force that corresponds with it, in this case, for instance, taser. The second agency, you can see the difference, right? If you look at that, I think you can get a pretty clear grip of what the progression is. Then you go to Albuquerque, and it gets a little bit more convoluted. Here they just have 4 levels of suspect behavior and force behavior. And they give a little bit more discretion to officers of what type of tactic to use, particularly if you look at the non-cooperative category. Non-cooperative in this case would include someone that's not physically resistant, but also includes low-level physical resistance, such as defensive evasive movements. Then you have Knoxville, back to a kind of this 5-layer, and they link it up a different way in terms of looking at threat level and harm. Then you have St. Pete. They represented, if you remember, 10% of the agencies used what's called a matrix box design. It's really the same thing. It's just depicted differently graphically of what's allowed by checkboxes. Then we had some agencies that gave no graphical depiction. Everything was text, but they link up the method of force with the resistance of what they want their officers to think about in terms of how to control the suspect. Fort Wayne's very similar, kind of both sides of it in a text format. Then we had some agencies, that's why we included Columbus, because there's some agencies that only lays out the continuum of the force, doesn't lay out resistance. So it's up to the officer to determine when to use these different levels. And then you had, this is the opposite end of that restrictive statement I mentioned. This is our least restrictive department, which uses the circular or wheel model. And Colorado Springs specifically didn't want officers to think about force progression. That's why you see there's no natural progression here with the officer standing in the middle. They basically were trained, and part of the policy, you use any of these types of force you think's appropriate given the situation. And we don't want you to think hard hands before taser. We don't want you to think taser before hard hands. We don't want you to think chemical spray before soft hands or vice versa. It's completely up to you. It's a lot of discretion for the line level officers to handle the situation. So with those 8 agencies, again, we went, and for the 2 years, we collected all types of data. You could see that it's data rich. As Gene, we were going through the presentation this morning, there's a lot of data rich. There's a volume of data here across those 2 years in terms of the way it played out. So how do we attempt to link these 8 agencies with better, worse policies? Although we have to qualify the term worse. It's not really worse. It's just in comparison with other agencies. How does your agency compare? These are the different outcome measures we came up with. You may come up with more. But, one is, you see at the top there, how often do you use force? Not just the raw number, because raw numbers really don't tell us anything. How often do you use force in comparison to number of calls you handle, number of arrests you make, reported crime, that sort of thing. Then we looked at proportionality. How often do you use higher levels of force, such as, say, a taser, with a verbally resistant suspect versus physical? So how does proportionality fit into the equation? We'll talk about that. We also looked at injuries, both on officer and citizen side. The 5 and 6 are getting at the line level officer views of the policy. And then the last is citizen complaints. So I'll walk you through just the first one. I'm not going to go through all 7 of these. We'll be here all day. But I'll walk you through the first one and then show you how it links to some of the others. So here's the 8 cities compared to each other if we standardize. So again, we're not looking at raw numbers, but we standardize across how often force is used, for instance, number of calls for service, reported crimes and arrests. So the green are the top, are the best. So Colorado, for instance, Colorado Springs, for every 729 calls, officers reported using force 1 time. And the level of force across each of the cities was beyond simple hand control, beyond the simple restraint or firm control. So they were equal in that way. So they used force, and you go over to Portland, which reported using force 1 out of every 102 calls for service. So essentially what you have here is you have Portland using force 7 times more often per call for service than Colorado Springs. And you can kind of compare where agencies are, because it's not based on the raw number, it's based on your service calls, or it's based on reported crimes, or I think arrest might be even the best indication of this. And then we simply ranked them, if you look at the bottom part table here, and we said, well, okay, let's just do a simple scoring system and see where agencies. So the way this is laid out is the ones on the left used force in terms of workload measures, the least amount, and the ones on the right, such as Fort Wayne, used it the most. So that's just one outcome of the 7. So if we look at it that way, we take what we found here, and we can kind of do this best and worst. And we put quotes in worst, because it's not worst per se, it's just in comparison to the others. And Colorado did very well here. But then we looked at proportionality, and you see Colorado goes to the bottom list. We did the same kind of thing that we did for 1, but we looked at proportionality. We said, wow, they didn't use force that often per workload measure, but they're disproportional. And when we looked at the data, we found over the 2 years, exactly half, 50% of all your use of force cases were with the taser. The next closest agency was Portland with 23%. So Colorado Springs was using double the amount of taser usage than any of the other cities, which puts them more in the non-proportional level. So you start to get a picture, and we were really, well, I don't have much hair left, but we were pulling out our hair, proverbial hair, trying to make sense of this early on, because we were looking for that elusive best policy, right? This term we like to use all the time. We're doing best practice or model policy. We were looking for that, and we were starting to say, we're not sure there's a best policy. There seem to be better policies on some outcomes and not so good on others. And so when we put in the other measures of complaints and injuries and how officers use, you'll see agencies, it really depends on what your issue is. And so it's very contextual in our mind. So if you look at St. Pete here that I have in red, you'll see in box number 3, St. Pete did well on injury. So officers were reporting a low level of citizen. When they used force, very few citizens were getting injured. And that corresponded, if you go over to box 7, and they were also getting few complaints. So that's a good thing, right? If you're an administrator, your citizens aren't getting injured when officers use force and are not complaining. Positive thing. But then you look at how do officers feel about it, and they weren't overly crazy about their policy. And part of that, through our qualitative interview with them, follow-up, was that they tended to feel like, again, the taser seems to come up a lot, they felt like their policy was a little too restrictive with the taser, and that was driving their dissatisfaction with the policy. So they didn't particularly like the policy, but we were getting benefits out of it in terms of citizen injury. So as an administrator, you kind of got to make a decision there of, a little disgruntlement by the troops is maybe worth the level of complaints being down. We tried to look at lawsuits, but it was hard to get enough data to give any definitive statements. But I imagine if complaints were down, lawsuits were down, and you weren't spending as much on the litigation side as well. You'll also see Colorado also fell at the bottom of some of these. So you got to be careful. If you just took how often do we use force, you would think Colorado policies, really good, and maybe we should replicate that. But if you look across the other outcomes, you may come to a different conclusion. So the next thing we did after all these 8, what we decided to do is drill down a little bit deeper, and we honed in on 3 agencies, and I'll bring them up in a minute, where we said, okay, let's look at 3 agencies of how officers feel about them in more specific terms, and how it's linked to behavior. And these are the 3 agencies we picked simply because they offered us a very restrictive policy, which was Charlotte, a very non-restrictive policy, which was Colorado Springs, and then this middle-of-the-road policy, which was Albuquerque. And this is just our description of how we describe them based on the graphic depiction as well as the text portion of their policy. And I won't read all of this, but you can kind of see how we characterized it here. So again, just so you can see, that's our most restrictive, that's the middle of the road, and that's the least restrictive, so officers have a lot of discretion. So, in terms of attitudes, we looked at 2 key questions. We looked at more, but 2 that we're going to focus on. One is, we asked the officer specifically, does your policy provide adequate guidance, specifically when force can and cannot be used across different levels of citizen resistance? So we specifically asked them, is your policy give you appropriate guidance for how to deal with passive resistant suspect, verbally resistant suspect, defensive resistant physical, active physical? We boxed them down to that level of specificity. And then we went the opposite end. Do you feel your policy's too restricted? You don't have enough guidance to do your job. And this is just a simple frequency percentage. And so if you look at the overall in green at the top here, not overly surprising in our mind, although it's still a high percentage. But you see that Colorado Springs 81.8 versus Albuquerque and Charlotte 88 to 90%. Colorado Springs was saying overall they were reporting that they felt their policy offered less guidance than did Charlotte and Albuquerque. And that was our interpretation as well. And particularly when you get down to the numbers in red, you see 70% for passive and verbal, and then you get up into the 80s for the others. Essentially, St. Pete was saying, I'm not getting a lot of guidance, particularly dealing with non-physically resistant suspect, that this policy is not giving me a lot of guidance there. And this is just a fancy, academics can't help ourselves. We have to put some multivariate models in here, controlling for a number of things. What this is telling us, again, Colorado Springs, officers are significantly less likely to believe their policy is offering adequate guidance of when force can and cannot be used. If we flip the script now and ask about, is it too restrictive, we see an opposite effect. Colorado Springs, they don't think their policy is that restrictive, right? Only 42% said yes, because they have a lot of discretion. Where Charlotte, 66% said, yes, I do think it's too restrictive. And you see the restrictiveness tends to play out in the opposite direction on the physical side, where Charlotte's thinking, yes, my policy's too restrictive because I think I have to wait too long, particularly to use higher level force, which is predominantly the taser in this particular case. Again, we ran multivariate model, and the same findings came out. This is just telling us that both Albuquerque and Colorado Springs are significantly less likely to think their policy is too restrictive, which means Charlotte thinks it is. So a couple takeaways from this section. It's kind of a middle balance, right? Officers want some guidance on how to deal with non-physically resistant suspects. I think the history of law enforcement does a good job with training and getting officers prepared how to deal with that physically resistant suspect, but it can be a challenge how to deal with the suspect that's not complying but not physically resistant, that's verbal or passive. And particularly in today's day and age where all the rage is using the term de-escalation, what's often missing in that equation, though, I think, is escalation. And how do we balance this out? And giving officers guidance for how to deal with passive and verbal can be particularly challenging. And then the second part here, they prefer a policy to officers some degree of guidance, but they don't want over-restriction, right? It's like hone them in some, but not too much. This last thing I'll do here before moving on is we did something else unique. We asked officers themselves, think outside your policy. If you were in charge, how would you draw up your policy? What would your use of force policy look like in terms of how you would instruct officers to use various levels of force across various levels of resistance? And what's in red, the demarcation line here is simply a majority of the officers. So everything in red is the percentage. So if you look at verbal, for instance, and you go down to 71.9, essentially what this is saying, a majority of officers thought dealing with a verbal resistant suspect, I should use verbal direction, verbal commands or threats, and at most soft, empty hands. But things above that I shouldn't use, or the less majority of the officers. And if you take this here and you play it out in a graphic form, this is what, and this is from all 7 or 8 cities on this one, 7 cities. Because one city we didn't do this particular survey in. This is what an officer-based line level continuum would look like. And so they would, this is their progression. Again, not specific, you wouldn't have to start here, none of that. But they're essentially saying, I see chem or OC spray before using a CD. But I think in my experience working with these different agencies and doing other projects, I think a key there is they see the OC and taser before hard hands. And that's a big debate in my experience. Should we go hands-on before the taser, or should we use the taser before hard hands? Officers like having those weapons as the a priori or the default position before I go hard hands. That's kind of an interesting, again, you see the site at the bottom here. All of these, you can find the details of the specifics of the project. How are we doing on time? Okay. The last thing I'll go over, and then I'll turn it over to Gene for the quick hitters, is this last part, which I think is huge, because it's one thing, how are officers feeling about it, or how do we view a policy, but is there a connection to the behavior? So we asked, again, going back to the 3 agencies of Charlotte, Albuquerque, Colorado Springs, to what extent do they translate, or are they related to use of force behavior? And we looked at highest level of force. We characterize it this way because this is what the majority of agencies, how they link it in terms of severity. But we also looked at cumulative force, which simply counts up the number of and types of force tactics. So it takes into account all force used, not just the highest level during the encounter. And then we did a specific analysis on taser, no taser, to see how the policy affects that. And here I'm just going to show the multivariate models. What this is telling us is Charlotte is the comparison group here, because remember, they're the restrictive policy. They're the ones that hone officers in. What this is telling us is that both officers in Albuquerque and Colorado Springs are using significantly higher levels of force than Charlotte. They're also using more cumulative force, so a greater number of force tactics within individual counters. Albuquerque and Colorado using more force than Charlotte. And then this one, just the nice thing about running this one, we honed it into defensively resistant suspects, that the suspect that's not attacking the officer, attacking someone else, but they're being, they're trying not to be handcuffed, or they're rolling around, they're putting their hands behind their back. How is the taser viewed in that? And what this is telling us, if you look in the far right side there in red, Colorado Springs was more than 22 times more likely to use a taser on defensively resistant suspect than those in Charlotte, because Charlotte's policy boxed them in on that. And even Albuquerque was 5.7 times more likely to rely on the taser to deal with a defensively resistant suspect. So what's kind of the key takeaway here? Well, there's merit to incorporating administrative policy, and I say quite specific and directs officers to use a linear and specific progression of less lethal force. It really fits more in that force continuum framework of guiding them along. And I put the caution at the bottom because, again, we all know from Graham v. Connor, if you're in this force thing, you know, the least or objectively reasonable force versus the least amount of force is not required. And we're not talking about the mechanical approach. We're not talking about the old school way of thinking about the continuum where you got to go step by step. But there is a link right here, and surprisingly, a big part of this project in the beginning was to see if less lethal force policy connects to something like less force. We found that. But this goes back to the deadly force literature 40 years ago when we started looking at more restrictive, when the fleeing felon law came to be, right, and then Tennessee Gardner came to be. What we found was a reduction in deadly force cases, something on the ratio of 8 to 1. So there was significant policy effect when agencies decided to restrict when deadly force could be used when you eliminate the fleeing felon shooting. We're finding the same in this particular study. It's the first study that's ever looked at, tried to make a connection between less lethal policy and less lethal outcomes. So there's a policy effect here that I think is important to consider when you're trying to instruct officers to use less lethal force. I'm going to pass it off to Gene to do our quick hitters, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A.
I guess I'm the closer. They didn't have my music to cue up, so I'll just come in without the music this time. Just by a show of hands, are there any representatives from any agencies that we visited that were part of this project? One? Okay. Because I think about that. How do we get our findings back to you? Because when we need a research site, and when the federal government says pair up with academic units, it's our obligation to get the information back to you. And so sometimes that happens in journal articles, which most of you are not reading, which I understand why you wouldn't read them. But from an academic side, that's what we're doing. But we have an obligation to bring it back to you, and that's what we're trying to do in forums like this. But we also rarely get the opportunity to go back to our host agencies and say, here's what we found. We send them the final report. But for you to know, what do academics do with the information that they're collecting? And we're not collecting it on you, we're collecting it with you. And so that's a big component of what we do as researchers. So when you sign an MOU to work with a university partner, you should have some sort of statement in there to get that information back to us. Get it back to us in some way that we can disseminate to our officers or to other people in our community, because one of the things that we do know, when we go to every single agency, they're always asking us, what are other agencies doing? So, and we would do that too as academics. What are other academics doing? We find that out. And so when Bill talked about, here's ways that you can standardize force across agencies, because raw numbers don't mean anything, right? So if it's 5,000, 5,000 might be great in some measure, 5,000 might be low in another measure. So you standardize it per your calls, per your arrests, et cetera. In addition to what the project was setting out to do for the federal government, and we said we're going to look at that agency survey to bring back to you what practitioners are using in their policies, what the policies look like. And then we're going to have some outcomes from those policies, and Bill talked about several different outcomes, and it's overwhelming to hear it at first, but it's 10 years worth of work for us. And so when we think about it, we can sum it up now, but as we were going, it was literally every single project led to another research project from the data that we had. And so when he talked about this project being data rich, it's data rich. These additional, and quick hitter doesn't mean that we were rushed in and rushed out, but quick hitter in the sense of they weren't part of the initial plan per se, what we were going to do, but the data were there. When you look at a use of force report, there's a slew of information beyond just who was involved in the event, whether it's the situational characteristics that become part of analytical models, et cetera. And so one of the interesting things for us was to examine the taser, and I'll say controversy at the time, but people were very charged up about what are tasers, the effects of tasers, and we said throughout each of the 8 agencies that we went to, they initially started with, is this a taser study? And we had to basically explain, as was the truth, it was a less lethal force study. Taser is just one option, and it wasn't a taser study. It's not about taser. It's about the entire continuum per se. And then what does the National Institute of Justice say as soon as we're done? Tell us something about tasers. So our first publications from the project were actually on taser use. And what we did find empirically is that based on officer assessments, so these are all use of force reports, they're not our assessments, we're taking it right from the officer's version, their self-report of the situation. Tell us about the probability of injury. And we're not talking about very serious injury here, but what we found was that suspects were more likely to receive injuries from tasers compared to other types of force. And there's a host of other factors that are related to that. But at the same time, officers were less likely to be injured when they use a taser. So going back to the good and bad news of much of our research, or how you assess good and bad in agencies, if you're an administrator and you're looking at this, you may say, I'm not so happy about the citizen side, but I'm very happy about the officer side. My folks are okay out there when they're using tasers. And so for us, as value neutral, this was an interesting set of findings. We also looked at citizen complaints. Now that was one of our outcomes, but we also got to analyze the complaints in more detail. And as you probably are aware, there's a small percentage of officers that are complaint prone. They always seem to be popping up in complaints. We empirically validated that here as well. We said that found that few of the citizen complaints were sustained. We looked at improper use of force and discourtesy complaints because they were related to our project. In terms of who is the recipient of an issue that was complainable, as well as the officer, males and blacks were more likely to file complaints. For your officers, males, prior military, those with less experience, more likely to receive only use of force complaints, not discourtesy complaints. And then sustained complaints were greater in departments employing citizen oversight reviews. Complaints referred to and investigated at officers' command level were less likely to be sustained. So it sheds light on the complaints that are received, who's sending them out, and who's the recipients of them as well. In terms of whether or not your attitudes can affect complaints coming at you. So if I have negative orientations, perhaps, does that translate into complaints in the future? And we found that officers who had negative views of management or their use of force policy were more likely to receive complaints. And then the crime fighter officers, when they were more positively disposed toward crime fighting and law enforcement, which is good policing, right? But it comes with it at the cost, perhaps, more citizen complaints. What this suggests is that officer attitudes matter, not only from what Bill is talking about in terms of your policy, but also in terms of receiving complaints. And then something that's near and dear to my heart, and Bill's as well, but this is where I started in the police area, is the occupational culture. And there's this idea that there's uniformity in police outlooks, that a cop is a cop no matter where. And you know that there are things that bind you together, but there's also drastic differences among and across police. And we found that there are some things that are more widely shared, like traditional accounts of police culture would suggest feelings of the danger in the environment, loyalty, maintaining control out there, crime fighting. Those were things that were more widely shared. And this was based on our officer surveys. The same surveys that were asking you about your policy were also asking you about your orientations toward the internal and external work environment. We also found, though, that there were some differences among police. And those differences on the bottom, not all citizens were viewed with suspicion. Some of the things that we think we know about police culture do not play out empirically. And that was important for us to tease out too. Again, this was not a police culture research project, but we can shed light on some of those dimensions through the surveys that we were conducting in our agencies. We also examined culture from a model perspective, meaning if we look at the dynamics of police culture and the internal and external environments and the way that officers cope with the job, a lot of which is based on the literature on police culture, and culture is essentially the way that you deal with the strains of the job, we found that there are some officers that are the traditional cop's cop, what we would think of, and some of those connotations are rather negative, but there's also a host of other orientations in police agencies, and you know this from working with folks, that there are some people you want to show up at your calls, and there's some people that you hope they maybe don't show up at your calls, okay? And empirically, we're finding that out as well. So why this is important to us is We like to, some academics and even government officials will talk about police culture and the negative components of it, which I would believe there's many more positive components of culture, but that it's monolithic, that there's no differences among police, and we know that that's different empirically. If we can get that information back to higher levels, that would be fantastic on our end. Another really key component that we're teasing out now is how important the police work group is, who you work with on a daily basis. Not your organization, not the entire field, but the people on your same squad, the people that you go to work with, the people that you have the same days off with. That matters in terms of your orientations, that kind of micro level, and that matters also in terms of your behavior. And in the social science area, we rarely find a connection between our attitudes and our behavior, but we've been finding that with respect to culture. So if you hear prejudice and discrimination, prejudice is an attitude, discrimination is a behavior. You may be prejudiced, but it doesn't play out behaviorally, and people would say, that's okay, just keep it in your head. Here we're finding out that your attitudes matter in terms of behavior. And that's really important, especially with respect to the work group, because now, perhaps if we can identify work groups that we're not so happy with, or maybe model work groups, we can, give or take the union, we can actually maybe modify our socialization patterns and say, hey, take Jones and put Jones in this work group and see what happens. Maybe it'll be better off for Jones there, at least from an academic point of view. Supervisory influences, interestingly, sergeants, first level supervisors had very similar views about restrictiveness and force options as the officers did when Bill talked about, if you could devise your own strategy for a policy. Sergeants influence officers' perceptions. That's good to know that the leaders are helping the subordinates in many respects, and it's affecting their job satisfaction. College education wasn't any part of this project, but it was something that we gathered as part of our survey. And interestingly, before we even started looking at the effects of education, we found a high level, 45% of officers have bachelor's degrees and 43% had some college experience. And this is important because there's a very small percentage of agencies that require a four-year degree, but what we found is that a large number of officers are college educated, regardless of the requirements, okay? So you have the options to select them. And so we have college-educated officers out there at the line level, because they're all patrol surveys. But what we're finding here, and this isn't the first time we found this in the field, you may or may not know this, but those with four-year degrees are less satisfied with their job. It may be that they're on patrol and they have higher aspirations. We also looked at aspirations. But that's important to know that you may be dealing with job satisfaction issues among those personnel, and maybe there's other ways to kind of make them satisfied about their job. We also looked at college major, because all of our college education research says maybe it's the degree major that you have that matters and not just the experience of going to college. If you're all criminal justice majors, maybe that doesn't matter compared to a STEM person and a business person. And we found, like much of our research in this area, that there's not much in the way of a college major mattering. So when you're recruiting people, if they tell you have the four-year degree, it doesn't seem empirically to matter which degree they have, what that major is. There may be an institution effect, which we can get at some other future time, what type of school you go to, but the major doesn't seem to play out. Promotional aspirations, positive relationship between officers' job satisfaction and promotional aspirations and career advancement. Males, non-whites, less experienced, and college-educated officers had greater aspirations. This is interesting too. Smaller agencies, those in our smallest agencies, had the highest aspirations. And in smaller agencies, there's less opportunity for advancement, but they aspired the most to higher ranks, and they expected to retire at higher ranks. And so getting that information back is important for us when you're dealing with the folks that you're hiring and training and keeping on the job. So what does this mean overall for today? What does your force policy look like, and how does it compare to any of those various outcomes of interest? What one message should be is there's no one outcome measure. There's no one way to assess your force policy. And if you're leading some group that's talking about use of force and you're dealing with just raw numbers by itself, do know there's a host of other things that you are aware of that you can present and say, look at injuries, look at attitudes toward policy, look at the way citizens are treated, look at the way officers are treated. And do you have the ability to assess force uses and patterns? And that's a question for you. What do you do in terms of assessing force usage and outcomes? And then as Bill talked about, watch out for best practices, because the best practices may be best for just that question, right? The good news here for us, and we say this routinely to practitioners, anytime, if people came to an academic environment to study me, which would be the most boring study of all time, but if you came there and you said, let me see what you're doing, there's going to be apprehension. Like, what are you going to find? What does this mean for me? And really, in social science, if you're coming up with all bad outcomes, I don't think you're looking far enough, because there's always the good and bad to all the stories. There's always a positive and negative, and you want to know about the negative. And Bill had mentioned before, we had an agency on board to look at all use of force, to look at complaints, but they didn't want to do the officer survey because the chief was burned before. And the chief was burned in the sense that academics came in as part of a group, and they said, we want to know about your personnel, and he was totally on board with that. But then they came back and said, you better do something about this. And that's a little much, right? You should make that decision to do something about it. Somebody shouldn't impose that on you. And so that's the way the relationship between we see academics and practitioners. And then, Bill, do you want to speak to this?
We're going to take a Q&A in a minute. This is a very awkward transition in the presentation, but I thought it was important. This has nothing to do with everything we talked about, but it's a study I just finished up and literally just came out last month. And I think it's apropos for this particular audience. I know there can be a feeling sometimes that the occupation's under siege and a lot of negative views from the outside. But I did a very in-depth study with some psychologists from Michigan State University that looked at police shootings. And if you look at some of the fine print there, we looked at it and did 144 different types of tests. And literally, what we essentially found when you benchmark or you compare police shootings across a number of measures we use CDC data, we use victimization data, self-report data, we use all kinds of data looking at involvement in risky behaviors, violent crime, that sort of thing, gun carrying and so forth. And when you take that into account, what we found was one finding of disparity and 144 findings of no racial disparity in police shootings across the number of measures. And, you know, again, I think it's easy to take some of these high-profile incidents or anecdotal accounts of a journalistic type of nature and come to a conclusion. But when you look beneath the surface and you do a systematic study, we simply found no discrimination. I thought that's a very pro-positive police message that we just wanted to throw out there. So Gene let me put it in there, even though it had nothing to do with the project. So let's take some Q&A. If you just go up to the microphone if you have a question in either of the aisles, we'd be happy to answer it.
Nice job. I got the 95% of departments that you found that were reporting use of force. I was wondering, did you dig down any further at what level that reporting is done? There's a wide disparity of, are they reporting only deadly force, or are they, going at different levels?
Yeah, that was part of the national survey. It just had one question on there, or do you have a separate distinct? Because at that time there was a lot of, is force still being collected, where you have to go into the arrest reports or the supplemental report to find out what force was used. And so we didn't really ferret that out as to that level. But you're right. I mean, that was part of selecting the 8 cities. We found that some agencies had a very high threshold for reporting, and some had a very low, and so we couldn't get those, we couldn't compare them agencies when they were all over the place. So at the 8 agency level, they all report at the same level, but we don't know at the 95% at the national level. My apologies.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Very
Can you hear
good.
me? Hi.
Hi.
I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands. My name is Captain Maria Jones. I'm from the training division. Quick question. When you made your assessment of the 8 agencies, was a review done of the reporting process?
Of the reporting of the form itself, or where it went afterwards, after?
Well, I know our policy also has a portion of reporting force. You have different levels of force, and there's a section that outlines the responsibilities of everyone in different, I would say, stages, the reporting officer, supervisor review. So I just wanted to know, when you categorize your agencies in less restrictive, more restrictive, if the reporting process was also part of that.
It was technically. What we found, if you remember from the national survey with all the agency, 91% were saying that there is this progression of review up the chain. Then we get to, so we're thinking 91%, 9 out of 10. Then we get 8 agencies that were part of saying they do that. But then when we get in there and look beneath the curtain, what we found is once it went by the immediate supervisor, it was a very cursory review. So we were finding very little of, essentially, we generally refer to it as empty formalism, that there was a review, but it really didn't have much substance behind it. And so technically it was review, but we weren't finding things that would be kicked back down, except in a very small percentage. So it was review, but I don't know to what extent.
But we don't know if the supervisor was doing the first level review, and then they kicked it back and said, this has to, you got to put these pieces together before it goes out.
Okay, another question. Did you get any complaints from the officers when you did your surveys in how cumbersome the reporting process is?
No, that we didn't get anything on the reporting process. In terms of the surveys, we had remarkable success. Of all the patrol officers we surveyed, over 90% of all the officers participated voluntarily in doing the survey. So they wanted to answer it from their side of the perspective.
And one last question.
All right.
What's your take in the use of, the increased use of tasers in comparison to the decrease of hands-on? We have seen that a lot in our agency. We are under consent decree, unfortunately. And we have monitors that constantly look at, well, your taser use has increased. But we say, hey, it's justified force. What we find the officers are saying actually that they prefer to utilize the taser in a situation than to actually go hands-on. Like you said in your survey, it decreases officer injury, but it increases citizen injury. What's your take on that?
My take is that's a continual debate that hasn't been worked out yet of what the proper approach is, other than if you're deciding, in Colorado Springs, we actually had a lot of senior officers comment on that would, again, nothing systematic, but anecdotally get frustrated with younger officers who they say they view the taser as kind of a panacea, a cure-all, that I'll just tase them rather than go hands-on. Why go to that? It's going to make things worse. Where more seasoned officers said there's a variety of ways to look at it. Sometimes it's hands-on, sometimes it's tasers. But, my take is I don't really have a take in terms of the proper approach. I don't want the taser to be looked at, though, as that cure-all, right? It could become a crutch. And, I'm doing a study with my research assistant right now who's actually looking at taser effectiveness. And we're finding that when if it's in probe mode, right, if you successfully get both probes to connect, and it is widely effective, but 1 out of every 4 across these 8 cities, 1 out of every 4 doesn't work that way, and so then it's not effective. So it's not this cure-all instrument. That's kind of my view on it. I don't like to see, I really want hard hands. Instead of having this progression, I want hard hands and taser to be at the same level rather than thinking about them one before the other.
Okay, thank you very much.
In what area did you note bias in your report?
What's that?
You said it was one area at 144 where you detected bias. What area was it?
Oh my goodness, I cannot remember. He told me that, yes. I think it was, I'm not even going to say. It's on recorded, so I will make a mistake. But if you access that article, you will find it's so overwhelming. 143 out of 144. It's just like, and if you look at a lot of the findings, and this corresponds with some of the lab work we're doing, which is a whole different beast. A lot of when we did find disparity, it tended to be anti-white. That officers our citizens that were white tended to have a higher rate of deadly shootings. Now, there are a lot of limitations with this type of study, right? National data set, it's only shootings that resulted in death, so we're missing a majority of the shootings and so forth.
One of the things you mentioned was perception, officer perception, obviously was one of the things you looked at. Did you break that down demographically by age and come up with anything? Because I know we do that internally as an organization, and we're seeing some trends and all based on just demographic changes, officer perception and things. So is that something you guys?
Yeah, most of the literature that we've been engaged in, the demographics kind of wash out except for experience. The experience seems to be the one that we can get something, and then education, but sometimes in the unexpected way.
Thank you.
I guess with Charlotte, I don't really understand the concept there. The policy or the continuum required them to go hard hands before they could go to CED. Well, you're already losing the fight, or you wouldn't be resorting to the CED. Did you communicate with the department to say you've got the highest officers injured as a result of this? Somebody needs to change the continuum, correct?
Yeah, well, that's part of this not only in terms of that, but this is where what's going on here. This is where the officers were frustrated because they were going hard hands before tasers and saying this is detrimental to us, and that's the downside. The administration saying we're getting much less force, though. When we hone you in there, you're the opposite of Colorado Spring. You know, only 15% of our cases are with taser, and they cause more injuries to citizens. And so you have to make the trade-off, right? You have to make the trade-off of you're going to get more force if you allow the taser before hard hands, and you're going to get more citizen injuries. So I mean, it's that constant balance. I mean, we could take the approach, and some do take this approach. Well, I don't care what happens to the citizen. If my officers are safer, that's the ultimate outcome. That's fine. I mean, you have to balance each of these out, and that's why some of them perform better than none of the other. What's most important in your department, sir?
I'm just curious, did you look at other studies regarding use of tasers? Because, for instance, there was a 2011 NIJ published study that said that overall they showed that citizen injury was 60% less likely in cases of active resistance when a CED was used as opposed to when it was not.
Yeah.
And if so, what would have explained the conflicting information there?
So the key difference is this. The researchers went in and recoded the use of force report forms to make their own determination of injuries. The researchers didn't like the fact that the puncture wound was considered an injury. And our take on it is, if officers consider it injury, who's us to say as researchers it's not an injury? And so the researchers imposed their own standard on that. And if you do that, then you get less injuries. We think the better person to assess whether an injury is the officers, not a couple of, Professor Schmoes.
Yeah, and in the probe issue too is if there's the blood from the probe or intake at jails will make you document an injury. For us, that was an injury. And that's why we couched the whole study in not so much seriousness of injury, because there are minor injuries. But if you're handcuffing a citizen and they bleed, you document that often as an injury from the handcuffing. So we said, let's keep it safe and keep it as is. The changing of the injury to state that it was an injury if it was in an unimproved area like the eye or the groin, that was not any part of our project. So ours was just, what did the officer say? The same way we wouldn't go into the officer injuries and say a sprained ankle isn't really that much of an injury. So we just kept it right from the official report.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. Anyone else has a further follow-up, feel free to come up and ask us, or if you see us anywhere, stop us and ask us. We love to talk about this. We spent a decade on it, so thank you.